All right, so we're now recording, and then I'll put it in the drive when we're done. Okay, why don't we turn to 1 Corinthians 7? And as you're turning there, what I will do is I will try to find her work on this, because it was really very, I thought what she did at the very end was really helpful.
Everybody could see it because it's on the Google Drive.
Right, I'll pull it up, and that way people don't have to try to locate it. Let's see here. Okay, let me begin with this question. When you in Mexico, how is singleness viewed?
Excuse me.
If you're unmarried, what's the general view of people towards unmarried people?
I think in the Christian culture, it's most of the time being single is seen more as a problem to be solved. It's yes, especially the older you get. So I think in general that's kind of like in the Christian culture, in the for non-believers, I mean, being single is becoming more and more common. If people do get married, they're getting married at a older age, and more people are living together instead of getting married, or living together first for a few years and then getting married. That's what I would say.
Okay, anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, I think the same. Also, in some churches, there is a kind of pressure by the pastor to the young people get married, jump in some processes also, like you marry with him, and because it's good, and the Bible say that.
Are there arranged marriages at all?
I know, like not like arrangement, but I know some churches they are doing a lot of person like, okay, you are single, let's together.
That's a semi-arranged marriage. It's a
Yeah.
desired arranged marriage. Okay. Well, when you look at the First Corinthians passage and you see the situation there is where you have a married couple and one of them comes to Christ, and Paul is then trying to deal with that issue, right? And so as you look at that passage, what is Paul's instructions to the married person when they come to Christ, and what does he say to them about being married or unmarried? Do you stay with your spouse who's now a non-believer? Do you leave your spouse? What is Paul's perspective on that?
Sorry, is 1 Corinthians 7?
1 Corinthians 7, yes. And really, we want to look at, let's see, I think starting in verse 12.
Okay.
Verse 12 through about 16.
I mean, he gives two scenarios, like when you have a believer, when you have a believer and a non-believer, saying if the unbeliever wishes to stay married, they should stay married. If the unbeliever desires to leave, then they should let them leave.
Okay. And if the unbelieving spouse wants to leave, what is the responsibility of the believing spouse in terms of marriage, remarriage?
I don't see that. I don't see any answer to that question.
It's
on the
interesting
text.
the verse number 14. It says that the husband that is not believer has been sanctified, or I don't know is the right word,
Yeah, that's right.
and also the wife, non-believer, she was sanctified by his her husband, believer. So it's interesting how the if the believer sanctify the non-believer because they are one.
Yeah, I mean it is interesting, right? Because there is a benefit when you think about two people who don't know Christ and one comes to know Christ, there is this benefit to that whole family dynamic because now you have somebody who actually is committed to peace and reconciliation and all these things is now in that mix. And so whether it's the spouse or the children are benefited also in that. David, if you go up to verse 11, 10 and 11, I didn't bring us into the right place. It'll address that issue.
Um, yeah, basically he's talking there to the, I think he's talking there to the couple that are believers. Is that correct? On verse 10, I think.
Yes.
I mean, basically saying if you're married,
Oh, correct.
on verse 10, he's saying if you're
Yes.
married, do not leave, the wife should not leave her husband. If she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or be
Yes.
reconciled to her husband.
Right.
And the
And so
husband should not divorce his wife.
yeah, so what's the issue there and how would that then play into the next part, both the where you have a Christian and a non-Christian and the non-Christian decides to leave?
Well, here it says if the non-Christian decides to leave, you should just let him go.
Right, but can the Christian then remarry?
I don't think that's answered on the text.
Yeah, okay, but if you were to apply the earlier part where the spouse leaves, right? If Christian couple and one leaves, you're supposed to remain unmarried. What's the point of remaining unmarried?
Because divorce is not part of God's plan. So, you're not supposed to leave. So it's basically the same teaching that Jesus was explaining in the Gospels. But Paul here, he makes a difference, which is a new thing that Jesus doesn't make any reference to. He's making a difference um, between couples that are mixed, like believers and non-believers.
Right, and so it says what if you're a Christian couple and you're married and one decides to leave, you need to stay unmarried. And what's the point of staying unmarried? What's the larger picture that God would like to see happen between the couple when they split apart?
That they get back together.
Yes, that they get back together. And so if the other person were to marry, what have they actually done in that marriage bond?
Well, they've broken it.
Yeah, they've broken it and they've committed adultery.
Yeah.
And so that then is part of the issue. And I think you brought up another really important part is when it says that but to the rest I say not the Lord. Paul is not disagreeing with Jesus and he's not just giving his own opinion. David, I think you're absolutely right. He is simply saying that Jesus didn't teach on this particular issue. So I now, as an apostle who has full authority, am going to fill in the gaps there for you. Um, yeah, and so with a couple who is both non-Christians, one comes to Christ, and the person wants to leave, then I would say I would apply that same principle that this person should remain unmarried until this person then gets married, because then they've committed adultery, and then I think that frees this person up to be remarried. Some people would disagree with that, and I'm okay with that, but that's the way I would understand it. Because if you're dealing with people in the church and somebody says, well, I came to Christ and my spouse left, what do I do? I think that the text, by 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 virtue of a principle that we learn from 10 and 11, can be applied in what follows. That, well, if they've remarried, then they now are having sexual relations in that marriage, you're then free to remarry. So, and we'll get to the more of the reason why there later. Okay, so that's the issue of when you have a couple and one of the people comes to Christ, how you can begin to deal with that. And then Vanya, we were going to have you talk about the benefits of being unmarried and some of the things that you learned and that you talked about within your group.
Yes, sorry for the inconvenience. Just suddenly the light just went out and then, oh, what's going on? But I don't know what you were talking about. Maybe that was a part of the divorce. Sorry. Or, okay. So now we go through 1 Corinthians 7 or what?
We were actually doing that. We were looking at 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 16, and just looking, if you have a married couple and one of the people comes to Christ, what do you do? And the idea is, well, stay together, because if you do, then that brings benefit. The whole couple is sanctified. If the person wants to leave, they can leave. And then I was raising a question that isn't answered directly in the text, but I think by inference from the previous verses might be able to apply, say that if the person who leaves, who's the unbeliever, remarries, then that Christian person who is left would be free to remarry. So then that's more dealing with that issue. And then if you could follow up with maybe focus on some of the benefits of being unmarried that people often miss.
Okay. Yeah, I in my project, what I did, I shared a few, but also it was just not my point. It was with the group that we were like thinking and how that benefits are part of our lives and enjoy. Sometimes we don't see it, but a person just mentioned it, and then we realize that, oh yeah, that's true. We have this benefit. One of them is that as a single person, we have the potential to please God with fewer distractions. Okay, you have there. And yeah, because we saw that our minds, heart, and souls is just connected to please God. We don't have distractions from having a family, the spouse, kids, and do this and that. We just enjoy our times, of course, as I said, with less distraction to please God. The other one is being single give us flexibility of service. And we discussed this in order to go deeper in the 1 Corinthians, so the first of two benefits. As a single person focuses with fewer distractions on the things of God and seeks to live for God. That I think is similar of the first one. Single life offers space to grow in your faith and relationship with God, and at the same time finds contentment in. And this is something that sometimes as singles we struggle, but we see that, yeah, there's no other place to find contentment than in Christ. Enjoy independence to the fullest and not be accountable to anyone, and to venture into new experiences. It's something that we really appreciate and enjoy as part of the benefits. Time to explore your gifts and patience for different ministries and new opportunities. It's another one. Knowing yourself more and better. Organize your own agenda, your commitments and needs without depending on another person to carry them out. You invest and spend the time and money for your own care and needs. You rest and sleep more and better. Singleness has the potential to have a simple life with less complications, responsibilities, and expectations.
So Vanya, did you
Maybe it would be more.
with these other bullet points, is this things that you all came up with during your discussion time?
Yes. Yeah, there was a time that we were talking about this in the past. We meet once a month, like an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. And I remember that we were like talking about these, like we call them the blessings that we have as singles. And I went to that notes that I have taken and include them to the discuss, and we were just saying all these things, and then I came up with a summary.
Yeah, how about when you guys all look at 1 Corinthians 7, do you see anything in addition to what Vanya has put here that you would add in terms of benefits of being single or unmarried? So like if you go from verses 32 through 35,
I just was wondering, like, these benefits to be a single is with a Christian perspective, but what about with a non-believer perspective? Like, I can see that being a believer give a lot of purpose in the singleness, but how about with a non-believer? I just wondering, like, what is the view of a non-believer to be a single?
I don't know if they see these as, I don't know how benefits they could find as an unbeliever, because sometimes, as I mentioned, being single as Christian or non, we have a pressure from the world all the time, and that perspective change. So as a believer, I would say that the at least the third or the fourth one are connected to God, and the less are like with life, you know. So of course they're not gonna see this perspective like being connected to God, the relationship, please God, but maybe the last ones, you know, like in your daily life, we could find. But I don't know. It would be interesting as if they, what are the benefits, or how do they see these benefits?
so Vanya, what might be a point of connection where you could use what you've learned if you're dealing with an older unmarried woman and the gospel? How could you see that connect?
With the non-believer?
Yeah, so let's say that you have an unbelieving friend and maybe she's in her 40s, unmarried. She's not very happy in that state. Her parents are constantly pressuring her. What would your study of 1 Corinthians 7, how could you connect with her and help her connect the gospel to her situation?
I really would like to have the chance to go through these with a non-believer and see what this person says about it. I have never do this, so it will be very interesting what this person thinks, especially about what the Bible says, if the perspective change, or yeah, I don't know what it's gonna be the discuss, but yeah, I really would like to do and go through these.
I would expect that those points number 5 and number 6 would be like in this era where women are educated and have powerful careers. I would think that a benefit would be that you wouldn't have to worry about where your husband's job was. You could just go and achieve the highest level or where you were interested in very easily, much more easily than if you were married and had a family that you didn't want to move around all the time. So that would probably be a benefit. But a disadvantage would be you had to totally support yourself.
Yes, I
Yeah,
think
so go ahead.
all the pretty much all the advantages that are not related directly to just having more time and attention to focus on God. I mean, I think a non-believer would still enjoy all those other advantages, you know.
Yeah, verses 32. I don't know how to say that in English because I cannot change it, but libres de preocupación, like
Yeah. Free from concern or
free
worries.
from, yeah.
Yeah, I mean there's a very intentional focus. And I was 37 when I got married, and prior to that, I mean I was laser focused. I still am a very focused person, but it's like playing basketball. I mean, I got to keep an eye on two things at one time. I got to watch the basket, and I got to watch the person that I'm defending. And so now I got to watch. I've got to keep my eye on the Lord, but I also have to be very concerned with the issues at home. You know, so when I'm in the office and I'm trying to work and I hear things, the volume start to elevate with homeschooling, I know that I need to run, put my principal cap on and get out there. I can't hide in the office and say, well, I'm doing something spiritual and say, Gwen, I hope you survive this one. But I actually have to jump out and get involved in the process. So, yeah, so that undivided focus, I think, is a real advantage for the Christians in particular. Okay, anything else you guys want to add, or that you think that you've either seen in the text or that it's important for us to understand?
And I had a question of, you know, we say that singleness is a gift, you know, and then, but I don't know if that was stated as in opposition as, well, marriage is not a gift. Is that kind of like or do we view both as they're both gifts?
Yeah, I would view, I mean, this is my personal thoughts. I'm not saying that this is correct, but I view my spouse for certainly as a gift. And I think that marriage is sort of the norm in terms of how the majority of people will get married. And that's by design, but God also has very strategically placed unmarrieds within that because they, again, can be. Paul, I don't think could have pulled off what he did if he was married. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, because, you know, when he's in prison, he's being persecuted. Now he had his attention's divided. He's got to think, well, gosh, now I'm going to leave my family. My kids. I can't, you know, what am I going to do with all that? But I think, you know, when you look at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 7, I think the assumption is that the norm is marriage. And then he says, but with that being a norm, there is also this group that if you are having difficulties sexually, then you don't have the gift, right? And therefore you should get married. And so I think he's using that idea because the way we're wired, the majority of us, is that the sexual draw is really strong. But he's saying that there are some people that God has tempered that, and they can stay very focused and not have problems in that area, and therefore they should remain that way. I mean, that is the gift, right? That he has taken those very strong desires and he's tempered them in a way that allows them to stay focused and not be, oh, woe is me, I'm single, I really want to get married, I can't handle myself sexually, I don't know what to do. So I think that may be more the element of the issue of the gift. I think our state is always is a special gift from God because he's wired us that way and he's made us that way. But I think the idea of a gift here is very focused on the fact that the person can handle them. They don't have a problem in the physical area. So,
Thanks. Yes.
anything else? So Vanya, I do have a
Just
question. Oh, go ahead, David.
oh, hold on. Yeah, I just there's a part there that said, there's no command, to be unmarried. There's not a command to be married, like either, like an explicit command, I mean, I think we can definitely see God's plan, what we see from Genesis 1 and 2, uh, uh, but Paul even, what verse is it? He says that, not being unmarried is not for everyone, and being married is not for everyone. So I think he's treating those like they're kind of like in the same circumstance as far as what God expects or what God asks. So that's just a question I had, that I wrote down, is that, well, I mean,
I was wondering the same. I was thinking in examples in the Old Testament about the being single, because in my daily plan reading, I am focus on the Torah, and I see a lot of for example, when the men go to the war, they are very go and live, and after back to war. But I was thinking in examples to be single in the Old Testament. So I was wondering similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is no command either way, and therefore I think that allows us to have freedom. But once we make a commitment, if you're going to make a commitment to be single, then you have to be celibate. If you're going to make a commitment to be married, you can't be celibate by virtue of the fact that you're now married and you have an obligation to your spouse. You're not your own, but you're your spouse's. And then you also have to stay within your sexual union. You have to keep that within your marriage. That doesn't get to go outside your marriage. So to me, the commands come after the decision has been made. Do you know what I mean? And therefore, we have tremendous freedom. And I think the the single and the married, there's no difference in the eyes of God. They just have a different role within how they're going to walk with God and how they're going to relate to society. And I think that it very much is the same between a husband and wife. They have parity in terms of their equality, but they have different roles and functions within society. And when we confuse those things, then that is where we have problems, right? And then all of a sudden, well, no, you shouldn't be single. That's a problem. You're too old to be by yourself. And it's like, well, no, because I mean that's the way God made me, and I'm good with that. Well, you should be, you shouldn't, you're married. It's like, well, that's who you're married to that person for life. There's no back door. And so that to me, that's where the commands come in. And that sort of is as a segue, unless we have more, go ahead, Vanya, on the issue of being unmarried.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that when I found that it was a key being single and at the same time married, and I understood that it's not a command that all of us must be, like married or seeking for a spouse, but I understood that marriage is a covenant, because when a man leave his father and mother and join it into his wife, and they become one flesh, that I understand that that's the covenant, that relationship start between them, just one flesh. So it was very interesting to see it in that way.
See it through the eyes of covenant.
Yes, yeah, marriage a covenant, not a command. Command?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a really good perspective. Right? Because the covenant is that's something that you are agreeing with that person to do, versus the command. Well, oh my gosh, I'm just sort of stuck. God commanded
Yeah.
it. I'm going to be obedient, but oh my gosh, I'm going to make life miserable for everybody.
Miserable, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good perspective, Anya.
Mm.
Okay, well, let me stop sharing here, and then we're going to move to the unpleasant discussion of divorce. Um, and that really takes us to, so I want you to turn to Deuteronomy 24, because to understand this issue, you really have to understand this passage. And unfortunately, for the Jews at the time of Moses and at the time of Christ, they really didn't understand this passage. The Pharisees weren't teaching the passage properly, and therefore there was a tremendous amount of abuse in the area of divorce. And always on the short side of the stick, meaning that the one who always got the worst part of the deal was the woman. So when Moses is speaking and when Jesus is speaking, he actually is speaking to protect the women. And it's really important to see that, because the way that the Jewish men were interpreting that was, hey, if you do something wrong, I can get rid of you and I can get a new person. Well, as soon as you do that, what happens to the woman in that society? Where does she go? How's she cared for?
You have to go back to her parents' house.
Yeah, if they would take her back, right? Because there may be, and if they had multiple children, and that's going on with multiple women within their family, I mean, their house could be quite full again. But very often what that did is it put them on the street. And when they were on the street, they had to make a living. So then how are you going to make a living on the street? You're going to have to do something that very often is against the law of God. So you're setting that woman up for just a very difficult life at best, but a life of immorality at worst. So let's take a minute just to read chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, just to become familiar with the passage. Okay, so just let's lay the passage out. What's the actual story? What's going on in the passage? Like, just we'll go verse by verse. What's happening in verse 1 of chapter 24?
That if a man and a woman are married, and if the man finds something that he doesn't like or approve from his wife, he can write her a divorce paper and send her off.
Yeah, so what specifically would he send her off for? I'm not sure what the word is, maybe in Spanish, or what if you're using an English version. Yes, Toya.
I was reading in English, and yeah, the what's mean indecent, something indecent.
Yeah.
What's mean like?
So there's a few questions, and one is, what is this? What's an indecency, right?
Yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
it could mean a bunch of things. You know?
Yes, and unfortunately, that's exactly what happened culturally.
Yeah.
So if a woman she was happy and she was twirling in the house and he just doesn't like her, that's an indecency. She burns the meal, that's an indecency. She says something disparaging against her mother-in-law, that's an indecency. And so the control of what the indecency was totally in the hands of the man. And so as soon as he was done with her, he would find some indecency. Okay, so that's one of the issues is that word indecency. So we need to make sure we understand that. The second is Moses writing this as a prescriptive passage or a descriptive passage. Do you remember the difference between prescriptive and descriptive?
Yes, I think, and the in the learning, in the path ride, you know, you is made the case that this is descriptive, you know, but I can't see that. I mean, this is all prescriptive, you know, because it's actually it's the law, you know. That'd be like saying, well, the Ten Commandments are descriptive, because all this in numbers is the law. You know, he was telling people how they should live and what they should do. So I don't understand the explanation that this is descriptive.
I wrote that, so I will try to actually explain that and see if I can satisfy that because that is the rub for some people right there is they see, and that's certainly how the Jewish person was seeing it, the man, that Moses is prescribing this. If there is an indecency, then you are free to divorce your wife, and therefore you can give the certificate of divorce. And that's exactly what the Pharisees taught, the exact same thing. Okay.
And that is and Jesus saw it as prescriptive too. He didn't say that's not the law. I mean, he interpreted correctly. So the fact that it was misinterpreted doesn't mean that it was descriptive and not prescriptive.
Yeah, we'll get there.
But yeah, I saw the whole thing, but it doesn't make sense. But because this is a law, it's not descriptive. Is something you tell a story of something that's going on and happening.
Right.
You know, like David and Bathsheba, or like, you know, in Acts, you know, the Pentecost, and you're describing something that happened. But this is clearly written in a way that is prescriptive, and it's part of the law, you know, that they're giving the people of God. But this is how you have to behave. So if this section is descriptive, then the whole other sections before and after have to be descriptive as well.
Yeah. So let's take a look at that because I think that's a very valid point. And the question is it possible that you can have a descriptive portion in a passage and then you come at the end you actually have the prescriptive portion of the passage? And so that's another question we need to address is in that. And that may address your issue and it may not, and you may not be satisfied with the answer I give, and that's okay. Because at the end of the day, we're all going to have to stand before God and make our own case, and that I'm not worried about that. So I really appreciate that, though. It's good insights. Yes, Toya.
I was looking for the word in the Hebrew. The word is erba, and means nakedness, nudity, shame, pudenda, and pudenda is like exhibition. So
Okay. Yeah, and we will see when we go earlier, it actually is defined in the chapter 22. And so we will see how it's defined in chapter 22. Now, the book of Deuteronomy is written to whom?
Jews,
Yes, but specifically whom?
the people is going to into the promised land.
Right. And who is going in and who didn't get to go in?
It's
This-
like The
Second
older
gen-
generation didn't get to go in.
Correct. So this is the second giving of the law. This had already been taught to the parents, and now this was going to be taught to their children because the parents all died, right? And so he is going to try to say, look, you're about to take this land. You need to live in a certain way because you're my people. And therefore, when you live in a certain way, you will display me to the world around you. Okay? And this is a problem that this culture is having, is how the men are treating the women. That the way they have defined indecency is something that's not indecent. And so Moses is going to make that case. Because then he goes on, he says, look, when a man takes a wife and marries her, right? So far we're good. And he has found some indecency, right? Some indecency. It's very open for interpretation in her, and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from the house, right? So he's just setting the scene. I would say very clearly this is descriptive. He's simply describing something to, this is how you guys constantly do this, okay? But he's then going to point out when you do this, there's a big problem. And he's going to expose that problem in the rest of it. And so then he goes on to verse 2, and she leaves the house and goes and becomes another man's wife, right? She has no other choice culturally. She cannot take care of herself. She cannot fend for herself. And we see this in the book of Ruth, right? That she was left to gleaning. And the only reason why she was able to make it is because Boaz showed her grace, right? But otherwise, she was committed to her mother-in-law, and they were both going to die together. I mean, that was the mother-in-law's perspective. I don't have a husband. You don't have a husband. We're doomed. Okay? So verse 2 says, and she leaves the house and goes and becomes another man's wife. You have forced her to do this. That's the idea. Because you saw some indecency in her, you forced her now to leave the house with a certificate of divorce, which in your mind is binding, and therefore she now is going to go out. Right? And then in verse 3, what does she do? What happens to the latter husband? And the latter husband turns against her and writes a certificate of divorce and puts her into her hand and sends her out of the house. Or if her husband dies, who took her to be his wife, right? So it gives you two scenarios, but both of which she is now by herself again. Whether the second man says, you know what, I am also seeing some indecency in you, leave. Or he simply dies and she's alone. Either way, she's alone. So then the first husband, now in verse 4, what happens to the first husband? The first husband says, oh my gosh, she's available again. I want to marry her. Is he free to marry her?
No.
Why?
Well, it says here because she has been defiled. You know, that it's an abomination before the Lord.
And how is she defiled?
Um, well, it says another verse says she's ritually unclean. You know.
Okay, and how did that happen?
Could be for all the indecent stuff she did. I don't know.
Could be.
Because
I mean,
the first and the second
possibility,
found
right?
that indecent things. That's what they divorced, but it doesn't explain.
Okay, I think what has happened here is when he released her, the first man, right? He releases her for some indecency, and then she marries, and he releases her. He dies, and he wants to remarry her. He can't because she's now an adulteress. In fact, what he needs to do is stone her. That's what the law demands, is that she
So
be
now
stoned.
you're saying it's prescriptive.
What I'm saying is he's exposing to these men, your practice has created an untenable situation. You are causing this woman to first become an adulteress, and I'm going to show you that because by the time you want to remarry her, you can't because she's still married to you. but now she's an adulteress, and therefore you should stone her.
Yeah, Carl.
Yeah.
But if that was the case, shouldn't they have mentioned something when she got married to the second guy?
Right. And so
Why did they not mention anything? Because if if it's true that she was still married to the first guy when she married the second guy,
The second,
Mm-hmm.
then he would have to say something, no, that's not a valid marriage, or you're committing adultery. But there's no mention there
Right, because he mentioned
of
it
anything
earlier.
happening on the second guy.
Right, he mentions it earlier. All he's trying to do is he's addressing with this issue of the certificate of divorce. And he's trying to say that it's not valid. And I'm going to show you why it's not valid. I'm going to give you this hypothetical. It's a hypothetical, what he's giving there. Okay? And so the actual issue was addressed in chapter 22 in verses 13 and 14, and then in 2021. Because this is the way you deal with an adulterer. If she had committed adultery and that was the indecent act, then you would have had to stone her, right? Because in chapter 22, 13, it says, if any man takes a wife and goes into her and then turns against her, right? This is going to be the indecency issue, and charges her with what? Shameful deeds, and publicly defames her and says, I took this woman, but when I came near her, I did not find her what? A virgin. So
Yes,
meaning
but
that
that's
she entered
different
the
than committing adultery after you're married.
right.
That's
So she
the
enters the
beginning.
relationship in a non-legitimate state, right? Because she lied about it.
Right.
Okay. And then in verse 20 it says, but if this charge is true, then the girl is not found to be a virgin, then she shall be brought out of the doorway in the father's house, and the men of the city shall stone her to death because she has committed an act of folly in the nation of Israel, playing the harlot in the father's house, and they should purge Israel from its indecency. So she lies. You find out that she had had sex before marriage, then she is going to be stoned, right? Because she already is an adult. She's now causing him to be an adulterer because she has already been married. I'm sorry, she's already had sexual relations and lied about it. But the consequence of that is stoning. And so and that's why when Jesus is with the woman in what is it in I don't know if it's Matthew 8 or John 8, where he draws the line in the sand, and they bring her out, and it's like, this woman was caught in a very act of adultery, and what should have been done to her? They should have stoned her
Be
based
stoned.
on
yeah.
based on the law. And so this is the issue. If the indecency that this man would have seen was that, then the proper way of dealing with it has already been laid out in the law. You stone the person who is unfaithful in the relationship, and the person she was unfaithful with. They both get stoned. And so this indecency can't be that, this indecency. And so what he's saying is, because there is no adultery here, you just have found some other crazy reason to accuse this woman. You sent her out. Now when you want to remarry her, you can't, because now she's an adulterer. She should be stoned.
Yeah, but shouldn't that have been said the second man also? Like when the second man married the woman, there's adultery there too.
Correct. And that's what he's
So
trying to
why?
address.
No, but he's not mentioning anything about that
Adultery.
second man.
Right,
It's
because
only
again,
mentioning.
it's
It's only
a
mentioning.
hypothetical. He's not laying out the law. He's trying to expose a problem. And so he's giving a hypothetical. And so he's saying, look, you think just because you have found some indecency, which is not adultery, because if it were adultery, she would actually need to be stoned, and the person she had adultery with would be stoned. You're finding some other reason. And this is why Jesus addresses this. He says the only reason why you could even let your spouse go is for the issue of immorality, meaning adultery. That is the only reason. And you don't even have to do that. He's saying you can do that. And that would have been the proper understanding of this passage. And that's why he goes to this passage, is that these men were leveraging and abusing their understanding of the law. Because look, if she commits adultery, she has to be stoned. That is the law. So this indecency cannot be adultery.
So it was the law. So if it was the law, it needs to be prescriptive. They're just abusing the law or using it wrong.
Correct. But what he's trying to do is he's not dealing the second issue of when she remarries. That's just a hypothetical. All he's trying to do is say to the first man, you didn't have any reason to let her go. You were wrong. Don't do that. Now, I'm going to show you why you shouldn't do that by giving you a hypothetical. Assume she marries a second man and then you want to remarry her after she's free. You can't, because she's now an adulteress. Well, why is she an adulteress? Because when you released her, she was still married to you. You forced her into a situation of adultery. So you cannot hand her a certificate of debt unless she's an adulterer. But in that situation, you don't need to hand it to her because you need to stone her. That's the whole point here. So when you look at the second part, he's not trying to say that adultery is okay. That's not his issue. The hypothetical is to expose the wickedness of the man's heart for putting his wife in that situation when it's not ever called for by the law. The law never gave you this indecency clause. You made that up. And so I'm going to expose that to show you that it's wrong. And so if the indecency were adultery, then we can see by the previous situation where you have a single woman and she's going to get married and she's betrothed. You're truly married at that point. You're now just waiting to see if she's going to be pregnant, if she was faithful or not. Okay? And so when she finds out that she actually lied and she had another man, that is an indecency because she now has had illicit sex in the context of marriage and she lied about it. Then when you apply that to the verse chapter 24, this is my understanding that is he's trying to say, look, guys, you have totally got this wrong and you're about to go in and become a nation and you need to understand how to live rightly with your spouse. And you cannot give these certificates of divorce and claim some indecency has taken place because you're abusing the woman and it is not represented in the law at all. And if you really believe that she's done the indecency, which would be adultery, then you need to stone her and you need to stone the person she had the adulterous affair with. That's how you handle it. You don't make up some crazy idea. And you can read about this in extra biblical literature, why they would actually do this. She could burn the food. It's like, okay, that's an indecency. You're out. And so Moses is saying, men, you are so wrong in this area. And so I'm going to show you how wrong you are by one, pointing out what you do. That's the descriptive part. Giving you a hypothetical. That also would be a descriptive part. And then by virtue of my conclusion, you will understand prescriptively, don't do this. The prescription is don't do this to your wife because you're going to create a situation where she becomes an adulteress. And that's on you. That's not on her. Well, it is on her. God's going to hold her responsible too. But you are forcing her into that situation. And that's why Jesus deals with it, because the Pharisees were perpetuating that same teaching that men, if you don't like your wife, no big deal, you can get rid of her. And all you got to do is give her the certificate of debt or a certificate of divorce, claim that she's done some indecent act, and you are scot-free. And Jesus is saying, man, that is so irresponsible. That is not the intention of marriage. You know, what you brought up earlier, Vanya, that it's a man and a woman becoming one flesh. It's indivisible. It's like that bone, right? We said that when the bone is broken and it refuses, it'll never break again in that place. Divorce is never even an option for the Christian. Jesus then addresses this issue. He allows for it, but he doesn't command it. He simply says, look, for this reason, if your spouse commits an adultery, you can divorce. Because then what's the rationale there? Under the law, if she had committed adultery, what would happen? She'd be stoned and she wouldn't exist anymore, right? Or if he did, he would be stoned and not exist anymore. And so he's saying, then you're free. And then if you look at the Romans chapter 7 passage, you know, if you're married to this person, they die, and you're married to this person, you die, then it would seem that that person could be remarried. But that's why I say, David, that I think personally that though it is in the law, he is trying to describe a really bad situation. And then he gives a hypothetical to show and to expose the wickedness of the man's heart. To say, look, when you do this, you're causing her to commit adultery. Therefore, you know this has to be wrong. You can't do this. Stop doing this. And that would be the prescriptive element, is stop doing this. It's not, and this is why Jesus, I think, brings it up in 3 of the Gospels. It's not, you have permission to give the certificate of divorce for some indecency.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that helps.
Mm.
So basically, is here in this passage from 1 through 4, the prescription is stop doing this thing with this letter of divorces that you guys are using it as an excuse. You know, that's basically the prescription.
Yes.
The prescription is not, okay, if you don't like your wife, then write her a letter of divorce.
Right. And that's that exactly, the way you just put it is the two issues. The Jewish person liked the idea, the Jewish man, not the Jewish woman, but the Jewish man loved the idea that anytime I want to trade her in, I can trade my wife in and I can get a new model.
Right.
Moses is saying, man, that is really wrong. And let me show you. Don't do that. That's the prescriptive part. Then Jesus follows up, because the Pharisees kept teaching exactly what you were just saying, David, that they just were perpetuating this same kind of teaching. And that's why Jesus says, you have heard it said, right? That's the Pharisees teaching, but I say to you, this is what should be taught. And that's when you look in Matthew, that, well, we can go here. Let me pull up the learning experience at this point. We'll go. Is that clear? Because I'd like us to then go to the New Testament passages, because Jesus is then going to give a commentary on that. So when Jesus is teaching, he's actually bringing a commentary to this Deuteronomy 24, 1-4. That's what he's trying to do, is he's trying to address that issue, because the teachers, which would have been the Pharisees, they're teaching improperly. So in the Luke 16, 18, it says, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits what? Adultery.
Adultery.
And he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. So he's making it very clear. He's defining what the indecency is, the issue of adultery, right? And so that one's really straightforward. That divorce causes, so when somebody marries somebody who's divorced, that is an act of adultery. And the only reason it can be an act of an adultery is why? Because they're still what?
But married.
They're still married to the person who divorced them. That didn't just go away. That's that one flesh, that it's a permanent bond. It's that covenant that you were talking about, Vanya, that doesn't just disappear because a person decides to wave a magic wand and say, I'm no longer married. No, you are married in the eyes of God, and that's not going away. Okay? So that is the heart of what Moses was trying to say, and this is the heart of what Jesus says. Then when you get to, excuse me, Matthew, he expands on that, right? And he says, it was said, meaning that's what the Pharisees taught, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. That's the quote right out of Deuteronomy 24, correct? But, contrast, I say to you, so it was said, Pharisees teaching, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, and that was the point that Moses was really trying to make, is that your excuses are not valid excuses for divorce, makes her commit adultery. And that's exactly what Moses' point was. You have let her go from some indecency, and what you've really done is caused her to become an adulteress. Okay? And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So that doesn't change. She really still is married. But he does allow for unchastity the person to leave the relationship. Now, does that mean he's commanding them to leave, or is he simply permitting it?
Well, it's saying that yeah, I mean, he's permitting it, that if you do divorce because of unchastity and you get married again, you wouldn't be committing adultery.
And the rationale there is, so he's saying, look, because of the hardness of your heart, I am going to permit this. It is never a part of, it was not a part of God's design, but because of the hardness of your heart, the reality is living in a sinful, broken world, you will do this. And so I'm going to instruct you when you do this, that the only reason why this could even happen is because you're not faithful in your marriage. But even in that, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. You're not free to remarry at that point then. So when a person divorces, right, then the question becomes, is that person ever free to remarry? And we'll look at that, okay? So, but that is a question we need to answer. And it's not explicitly said, but I think it's implicitly, there's an answer to that. All right, so Jesus then throws in the exception clause because of the hardness, I think, of man's heart and living in a sinful world. Then when you get to Mark, here's the other part of Matthew, right? In Matthew's second address, he also addresses it. So you can look at that on your own. But Mark adds something in addition to the previous passages that wasn't there. And I think this has more to do with his audience. Because Mark says, where is it? Mark adds that not only can the man initiate the divorce, but the woman can initiate the divorce. And the reason for I believe for that is because Mark's audience is the Romans, and in Roman law, a man or a woman could initiate that. But it was still was because of marital unfaithfulness. So I think that's why Mark expands on what Jesus said to address his audience, which would have been a Roman audience, which both the man and the woman could institute or initiate divorce. Okay, so is that part clear in terms of Jesus' teaching? He doesn't permit it, but I don't think it was ever part of God's initial plan. But in a fallen world, he allows that to take place.
Carl, I read also that the common practice and what all these passages can be referring to, especially when they talk about, committing adultery, is when the person divorces with the intention of already marrying someone that they were either already lusting after or even already had sex with. That also seems to be part of what was going on and really what Jesus was addressing. When you divorce someone to go marry someone else, a specific someone else you already, had in mind or already had a relationship with.
Yeah, and I think that would go along with when Jesus was correcting their teaching on the issue of adultery, right? In Matthew 5, it says, you say that it's this, but I say even when you look upon a woman to lust, you've committed adultery in your heart, right? That the Pharisees were always trying to get away with as much as they could. And Jesus was trying to rein them in and say, hey, I think you're missing the deeper issues of your heart. So your point, though, is with what you were just saying, David, how does that relate to Jesus and divorce?
I think he was dealing with the issue of they're using divorce to cover basically sin that had already happened in their heart.
Yeah, and so in that, then the question becomes, well, I think whether it's going to deal with the issue of Paul's teaching, and you can see that in the learning experience here. And what is Paul's teaching on the issue of divorce? We looked at that earlier, right? If the spouse wants to leave, you let them leave. If they want to stay, that's desirable. Stay with them because you're going to sanctify them. You're going to bring some kind of a blessing by you being set apart for the Lord. They also benefit from that. Then the question becomes, and this is not as clear, is turn to Romans chapter 7.
Carl,
Yes.
I am going to have to leave around 11:30 today. I have an
Okay.
11:45 appointment, but I need to throw this in real quick.
Yes.
That was Steve who just called. And Vanya, I had asked him our question about the developmental paths. And he said, yes, we do have to do the 6 developmental paths for each of the character outcomes. And he's going to send me the link for the 3S leader one, which looks different evidently, but anyway, so we will have those 6 developmental paths that we need to complete before this is all over. So that's our answer.
Good.
Thanks, Nita.
Yeah, and again, it's not as daunting as it sounds, because the reality is the developmental path is simply saying, is there anything in addition to what you've been learning here that you want to add? And if you say no, then what you have done here is sufficient, and you would just say that what we did through the learning experience is sufficient, and that satisfies that. Does that make sense?
And we'll kind of review those learning experiences in that process, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
And I'm sorry I have to leave. I'm assuming that we will meet at the same time next week. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Thank you. And I'll see
Okay.
you.
Bye, Nita. Have a good meeting.
Bye, Nita.
Thank you.
So when you get to Romans 7, he's talking about the law and are we still bound to the law? And he uses this analogy of marriage, right? And the answer is, if you look at that, is the Christian bound to the law? And the answer is what?
Yes.
So you're saying that we're bound to live out the law.
Yeah.
Okay, where do you see that in the text?
Because it says on verse 2, for the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he's living, but if her husband dies, she's released from a law concerning her husband.
Okay. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. What he's talking about is what I'm understanding in this passage, right? He's just in Romans 1 through 4. He's looking at the role of righteousness, and that every human being, whether you're Jewish or Gentile, you lack righteousness, and you need that righteousness. Then 5 through 8 is going to show you how you get that righteousness. It comes through faith in Christ. But faith in Christ means that the law has been done away with, and now you're under the new covenant, right?
Right.
You're
Like
no
in verse
longer
4.
justified by the law.
Yeah, you're right.
Okay, so then he gives the analogy of, look, if the law was your first husband and he dies, when you remarry, you're free to remarry because you're no longer bound to that husband. Therefore, we're no longer bound to the law to be justified. Instead, we're justified by faith. That's his point. But I think there is another point here, right? And it's the same point that Jesus made, that when we looked at that we're going to be single in heaven. When a spouse dies, is the person free to remarry?
Yes.
Yeah, they are, right? And so if a person commits adultery, what's the punishment for the adulterer parties, the parties that did the adultery? Yeah, thank you, Toyo. Yeah, you're going to throw stones, right? And they're going to die. And therefore, that, from my perspective at least, that would then free that person up to be remarried. Because that person, when they committed adultery in the Old Testament, they would have been stoned. And so Jesus, I think, is making an equivalent thing, is that you no longer are now bound to that person because they've committed adultery. It's like they're dead. And therefore, I would say personally that the person who has been divorced and that person that they divorced has remarried and then has sexual relations inside that marriage, then you are free to remarry. Some people definitely disagree with that, and I'm okay with that, as long as they can justify it. But if the person doesn't remarry, Paul is really clear, you're not free to remarry. Right? So if I were to divorce my wife and neither one of us remarries, then I have to stay as I am, single, unmarried, because she's not been unfaithful. And the idea, hopefully, is that God wants them to reconcile, right? So that's my understanding of those passages. You'll have to come to your own conclusions on some things, but hopefully, David, we address at least the issue in 24 that you can still, and that's why it's tricky when we're reading the Bible at times. You're like, man, this is totally in a prescriptive genre, right? I mean, this is the second giving of the law, so this has to be the law, and that was the whole argument of the Jewish person, is this is the law, and therefore I can do this. And Moses saying, okay, if that's the law, then you're misunderstanding the earlier part of the law, and you're creating a new problem that should not have to exist. So stop what you're doing. That then, though it's not explicitly stated, that actually is the prescriptive part of that passage, at least my understanding of that. So I don't know if hopefully that helps, because trying to, and I don't know how much of a problem this is in Mexico, but my guess is that worldwide divorce is more and more a problem, and inside the church it's a problem. And how do we help people navigate that? How do you deal with the couple that is now just waiting on the divorce? It's just really a very sad situation. And then when you think about children and how that will mark them for the rest of their lives, and how that will undermine their understanding of the nature of marriage and the purpose of marriage, and how their commitment within that marriage and God's commitment to them, it's just a really unfortunate mess. So any other thoughts there that people want to offer?
No, on the learning experience, Carl, there's some
Yes.
questions on this part of divorce that says, there's two. One says, how should we relate with couples in the church who have been divorced? And then the next one, how should we relate with couples in the church who have been divorced and have remarried? So I guess there are questions because I guess there's some maybe conclusion we should have gotten from the learning experience. So I didn't really understand, I'm more curious about, what's one of the possible implications,
Right.
Behind those questions.
So for example, I'm in a men's study right now, and I'll try to lay out a number of the way I see this would apply. Is we were talking about this. We were in Ephesians 5, and we were talking about marriage, and we said, what happens if your spouse unfaithful? And man, one of the guys says right away, said, I would divorce her in a second. And I'm like, okay, do you have to divorce her? And he goes, yes, you have to divorce her. I said, okay, well, is that really what Jesus is teaching? And so we talked about that. You may have a man that just got divorced and he's in your study, or a couple that, you have a home Bible study, and you have a husband or a wife that's just come off a divorce. The other spouse hasn't remarried. How do you counsel them? You say, oh, you can immediately remarry, or, oh, you shouldn't remarry, or, oh, this is what you should do. So that's the first one, right? The second one is, what happens after now you have that same situation, but one of the spouse that's with you, her spouse now has married. Would you counsel her differently? And if you would, how would you counsel her differently? Because now she's gone, both parties were unmarried. Now one has chosen to get married. Does that change her status or his status in their freedom to marry? That's what that question was after. Is just to get people to think about it. Does that make sense?
Right. So you would say that if a person is divorced for whatever reason, you know, well, let's say a person's divorced not because of unfaithfulness, just because, you know, he got tired of her, or, you know, he didn't love her anymore, you know, that person shouldn't remarry unless her spouse is married.
Yes, I would say that that's an illegitimate divorce, first of all, right? That's not even permitted. I mean, Jesus doesn't even cover that as one of something that would be permitted. So I would encourage the couple, don't divorce over that. That's not even biblical reason grounds for divorce, and therefore really don't get married, because as soon as you get married, you're committing adultery. Okay, and that's on you, but that then I would say also frees up this spouse to remarry. But again, I would go back to the original thing, which is, can you guys just work this out? Especially as Christians, that we're all about the gospel of reconciliation, and therefore it's you have an obligation before God to work this out, because you're reflecting the Trinity, and the Trinity doesn't sit there and say, yeah, well, I'm going to do my thing and you're going to do your thing, and we're just going to have this amicable separation. It doesn't work like that. And so divorce to me is not even an option. One, I would never even have that discussion. It would never even be on the table, regardless.
Right.
But other couples, they do are having that discussion. And so what do? You have to do exactly what Moses did and what Jesus did. You have to say, okay, we're in a bad situation. They've already made a bad decision. What's the next right decision within their bad decision?
And so that person would be in a state of adultery the rest of his life.
Yeah, I would
How does
say,
that
yeah. I
work?
mean, once you've committed adultery, you're an adulterer, right? But as soon as, yeah, I mean, I don't know how you, yeah, I mean, I guess I never thought of it like that, but I think you're right. But at the same time, because we're not under the law, we don't stone that person. But Jesus would then say, well, you can do that because under the law, that person would have been stoned. And now you, who are the innocent party over here, are free to remarry. And some people would say, no, that's not the case. That they're forever married, and therefore, if this person's unfaithful, that's they're unfaithful. You need to stay faithful to that person. So, and again, I would say I wouldn't have a problem if you came to that conclusion, and you believe that. I certainly wouldn't argue with you on that. It just logically, it seems to go in the direction that the person's free to remarry. But again, I would never tell a person who's contemplating divorce, oh yeah, if you do get divorced and this person remarries, then you are free to remarry. I would say no. Let's reconcile. That's the only discussion I'd want to have with that person. Is please reconcile your relationship with your spouse.
Right.
Do whatever it takes to get that right.
So if a person that's divorced for the wrong reasons, and they remarry while before their spouse remarries or has sex with anyone. So are we saying that marriage can never be valid under God's eyes?
Yeah, I think it's not valid in God's eyes in the sense that you're still really married to this person. But now that you've done this, you're not going to be able to undo that and go back here. To me, because I mean, you're now an adulterer, and this person doesn't. There's no obligation for them at that point to have to marry that. I guess you'd say, well, they're still married, and maybe that's the argument, is that since the person still is married, therefore, if they leave that spouse, or then you'd say, well, we never were unmarried. You were just unfaithful in our marriage for maybe a period of 10 years while you're married to this other person. And that may be the rationale that the person who would say there's never a reason for remarriage, because you're always going to be married. And if it's an illegitimate reason for the divorce, then you're actually still married. And so stay within that. So if that was your rationale, I mean, that totally makes sense to me, actually.
Right.
So,
Yeah,
but
I
it's,
think it's
go ahead.
no, I'm going back, to what we say of, even when you do the vows and and we said that marriage is a covenant, it's a covenant between also a man and a woman. And but covenants, they're not permanent, you know.
Well, it depends. They can be, right? Like the Abrahamic covenant, it's a unilateral covenant, meaning, oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, because God
Right.
could break the covenant, but because the nature of who God is, he will never break the covenant. But the
Right.
covenant could be broken.
Yeah. So I think I have a hard time understanding the permanent condition of a covenant when, by definition, a covenant is broken when one of the parties, breaks or doesn't fulfill, his or her part. So I know the intention and the design of marriage is to be permanent here on earth or till death separates, you know. But I think the fact that that's the intention or the design, I don't think that necessarily makes it permanent, because if one of the two parties breaks it, then the covenant has been broken.
That's probably why Jesus gives the exception clause, right?
Right. Yeah. But
But then how does that extend to the one that's not an adulterer issue? How does that play out in your mind?
well, I think it's you can well, one example is like abuse, you know, like physical abuse or sexual abuse or psychological abuse, that I mean, there's no sexual immorality if it's just physical, maybe, you know. But I think the covenant has been broken because, when you make a covenant, you marry, you say, I'm going to love you, I'm going to provide for you, I'm for you, and that unity in that marriage, has broken. I think that's just kind of like one example,
So for using that example, let's say it's physical abuse, right? And that you and your spouse are married, and let's say I'll just use myself and Gwen, and I'm physically abusive. I beat Gwen, I beat the kids. Are you saying then that she's free to divorce, or are you saying they should physically separate for the protection of Gwen and the kids, but they will remain married?
I think that'd be a valid reason to divorce, and even going more to the fact, well, whether it's valid or not, or there's a valid reason or not, like people decide to get divorced, right? Many times it could be unilateral, let's say I want to stay married and there's no unfaithfulness, no infidelity, but just my wife, she just, wants a divorce, and they do it, the divorce goes through. To me, that's, well, the covenant, the deal, the pact, is broken. So just to keep thinking that even though we have the divorce, that we're still under God, married, that doesn't like make sense.
So how about the two non-Christians, they get married and one says he wants to leave, then that you're saying that person immediately would be able to be remarried. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, I think because I think, if you have a contract, well, then you break that contract, and then because you're free to start another contract, and
Yeah,
simple ways of putting it.
Okay, so let me ask Toyo and Vanya, what do you think of what David is saying? Would you agree with that or disagree with that? And it's okay. What we're trying to do is understand. So it's not a
Right.
personal attack against David or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
It really is trying to understand the issue.
No, I know. It's very interesting because, I'm not in that situation. But when I think about what David's saying, to understand God's perspective and try to say, okay, I just want to see what the Lord says on this, or the people who want to remarry, if they really want to, what is this new how could I say, view, even God and the society, because I'm struggling with this, because I have friends who divorce and remarried. And then what David is saying, I'm thinking, I have a friend who got through this or went through this, but so what they did is wrong now, because even their spouses are alive, so they continue being married. So it's very difficult to understand, or hard to understand. Yeah. But at the same time, I think, what's the word? Do they deserve to remarry with a person? Like, is that possible? It's hard.
Toyo?
Whew. Well, I know that is hard to know that a person that is divorced and they married again, like by law, by the word, is not doing the right thing. I think it's hard cases. I think if it's under the divorce is by violence, or is better to stay separate and not married again, or let know that, give the advertise and the warning that if you married, you have sexual relationship with you are in adultery, or you are sin intentionally. So I think it's just, and it's not my idea, it's God idea, is that the Bible says. So I think our job here is like, be careful with that. Like you say, recommend considering this, because if you don't reconcile your marriage, you will be on sin if you married again, or you have a sexual relationship outside the marriage. So it's like, I see, but it's not easy. It's putting with empathy in the person is not easy, but it's the thing, is what the Bible says.
Yeah, and I think as I'm listening and as I look back at 1 Corinthians 7, 10 and 11, one is that legal does not mean moral, right? And the easy way to see that is abortion is legal in the United States, but it's certainly not moral. And just because a state would say, well, for the reasons of spousal abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse or You just didn't provide, therefore you're legally not bound to that person anymore. I think from what I see, at least my understanding is, but to the married, I give instructions, not I, but the Lord. If the wife should not, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried. And the only exception that both Paul and, well, that Jesus gives is the same one I believe Moses gave, is the issue of unchastity. And therefore, if it's one of these other ones, if if I were in this situation and I knew somebody, one of my friends, and you are beating your wife, first of all, you need to go to jail. Second of all, we need to separate you from your spouse and your children to protect them. But I would tell that woman, you are legally still married to this man, and let God work in his heart and try to uh, have him get his life back in order. Because really, again, I just keep trying to think in my brain, what in the world is the purpose of marriage? If it's only on this side of heaven and it's not on that side of heaven, it has a very unique role. And therefore, we don't want to undermine that role in any way. And so my understanding of what it is one is it honors God and glorifies him, right? It makes the invisible God visible, because even when things stink, I will stay with you. If you have a turn in your health and you're no longer able, you're going to have a disease where we can never have sexual relations again, you can't even talk to me. I will stay committed. When I look at some of the men in our church or the women in our church who have husbands who have Alzheimer's, or the woman who has Alzheimer's, and they are faithful in that relationship, those are my heroes. I'm like, wow. I mean, seriously, everything that you married is gone. That person is now just a physical shell of who they were when you got married. But your commitment is to that individual until it is over, because God made you one flesh, and right now it is never going to change, and it's really a sad situation. But I'll tell you, that has strengthened my faith so much to see these men and these women stay faithful to their spouses to the end. I mean, I think that's part of the whole thing is, and even with something as ugly as abuse, protect the children, protect yourself for sure, 100%. But I still think that's not a valid reason for the divorce. And therefore, you really still are married. And you then just love your children, and say the spouse is trying to get help, continue to speak well of that spouse as well as you can, and then trust that God will work in their heart. If one day they decide that they get remarried, they've now committed adultery. That is a valid reason for you to be remarried. If you chose then to be remarried, then remarry. But honestly, I think part of it too is, if you've got kids, your first and primary responsibility is those children. It's not trying to find a spouse. It's really to take care of those kids and to make sure they're developed and cared for and loved, and really see Jesus for who he is. And so that's in the mix. So I don't know. That's where I am right now personally in my understanding of, the Deuteronomy passage, Jesus teaching, Paul's teaching, that there really is one exception clause. But if we can avoid that at all costs, we should. If the person decides to do that, it's a bad situation. Don't make it worse. So now you got to deal with what's the next good in the bad situation. So, but I appreciate everybody's thoughtfulness on this. Yes, Toya.
Yeah, adding to this, I think the marriage have a non-believer worldview. Like, I think there is a lot of believers marrying with a light view of the marriage, and also with this pastor that, okay, you're single, go married, is a simplicity, a simply way to see the marriage, because there is a lot of implication and understand why is the biblical view of the marriage. And I think I am talking with other SLM's leaders in the area, and we are talking about this. We need to do something to prepare the Jones to be prepared to marriage. Not like, oh yes, because you like and you are compatibility or something like that. Okay, you go ahead, marry. So I think it's something that probably we can to take seriously in bring to the discipleship, because it's part of this. It's a way to show, to make God visible to everyone. So,
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point is when a person or couple decides to get married and you understand the gravity of that, there is no back door. Then whatever the issue is, you have to work through it. And I think that is really an important message to people thinking about getting married. No back door. Whatever problem you run into, I'm thinking of our number 3 son, he's about to get married, that I will very clearly tell him, look, there is no back door. So whatever problem you have, you need to figure out how you're going to work that out. You cannot just leave, because as soon as you give them the escape clause, that person has never grown in that area. They've not had to grow in that area. And you've given them a way out. And that's why I think Jesus is super narrow, but he only does it because of the hardness of their heart. He doesn't do it because it's a good thing, and he doesn't command it. He permits it, and that's another important part. Yeah, that even when we have a couple right now, they were missionaries in Portugal. The wife was unfaithful to the husband, and I applaud this man. He came off the field. The wife came off the field. They have children. They have been working through their marriage. I now watch them, and they are a vibrant, loving couple who eventually will go back to the field. But he didn't take the easy route, which would have been to exit. And I think that when the world can see that, that is a powerful, powerful testimony of the grace and the goodness and the power of God at work in a couple's life. And that's how I say we make that invisible God visible. And that makes the gospel attractive, because, I mean, that's the gospel lived in a very ugly situation. And I applaud that couple, for that man to stay in there and say, you know what, I am going to remain faithful to you, and we're going to work through this. And they're still here. They've been off the field now for 2+ years, and however long it takes. And eventually, when they go, man, I'm go for it. I'm so proud of you guys.
that's why Paul said, I would like you to be free of concern.
All
You
right.
don't
Well,
have choice, Victor Sanchez. So don't say it.
Oh, no,
all right. Well, Toyo, on that note, we'll let you get the final word as you pray, and we'll close it for here. If you guys could try to, how long do you think you're going to need to finish up this? It sounds like you're done with the learning experience, but to finish the actual learning experience by completing the project side of it. Can you do that this week? Or do you, David, you can?
I can, yeah.
Vanya?
I'm gonna try. I will do all my effort to finish the pad right, because I have been working on, but I know David it's went through other ones, and I haven't do that, so I just need to take
Yeah, so
time.
Vanya, I think for you, if you could finish Pathright and then change your A on the SMART plan, and then
Yes.
just chronicle what you did with the gals and some of the discussions you had, in about a 1 or 2 page document. Just saying, this is what we did. We met this many times. This is the discussion we had. Here are some of the conclusions we came up with. This is what the scripture showed us. Then you're done with this project, because you've already done the project side of it.
But when you say done, it doesn't mean that I haven't to complete on Pathright.
No, you do need to complete Pathright. So David has
Okay.
completed Pathright, but he needs to finish the project side. You have finished the
Oh.
project side pretty much, but I want you to capture that in a document. But you need to finish
Okay.
Pathright. And then Toyo, you get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I can understand.
So you finish Pathright and you get to do the project. And then what we'll do is we'll introduce the idea of the church, and that'll be the next to last one. There is something that's going to go with ending well, and that's the church history part. And that's more just like reading a book. So if you want to start reading that on your own, Ron Waters created that, then you can just begin to read that. And again, read it like you would read any book. If there's something you're interested in, really hone in on that. If not, you can read it a little bit more quickly just to get the general idea, and however that would benefit you. But next week we'll come with doing the second learning experience, which is the healthy church, and we'll go through how you can approach that. And then When you finish your part of whatever you need to do, just let me know, and David, I'll look at what you've done and I'll interact with it. And Vanya, if you could work through the Pathright side and get your document done, you'll be good. And then Toyo, you'll end up having to work on it. It sounds like both of them simultaneously, if that's okay. All right. All right. Well, Toyo, can you close for us then?
Great.
Ya. ¿Qué les parece? Dios, muchas gracias por este tiempo que nos has permitido estar juntos. Gracias por